Right now, you're probably thinking you have enemies, specific ones, clear-cut ones, people who get in your way, threaten you, or annoy you. Maybe it's a politician, maybe it's a country, maybe it's the neighbor upstairs. And you're sure that these enemies are real, that you're just looking at things objectively, that hatred is a response to something external. But here's an inconvenient fact. Long before your specific enemies appeared, your brain was already looking for someone to fill that role. And it's not that the world is full of threats, it's that without an image of the enemy, certain social mechanisms stop working. Society literally needs an enemy, not as a luxury, but as fuel. The only question is, who decides who to cast in this role, and why? It is commonly believed that a people only develop an enemy when a real threat arises. War because they were attacked, xenophobia because outsiders are genuinely dangerous, class hatred because inequality is unbearable. It all sounds reasonable. Threat, reaction, standard logic. But here's what's curious. If you remove the external threat, the enemy doesn't disappear. It changes. If you defeat one enemy, the next one immediately appears. If you destroy the image of the enemy within the country, they find one outside. If there's peace outside, they start looking for traitors inside. This isn't the paranoia of a few individuals. It's a systemic pattern that repeats itself across different cultures, eras, and political regimes. So the real question is not, why do we have enemies? The real question is, what exactly happens to society when there is an enemy, and what happens when there isn't one? Because the answer to that explains a surprising amount, not just about politics, about you personally too. The most obvious explanation is evolutionary. Our brains evolved in an environment where outsiders posed a threat. Tribe against tribe, us against them. The instinct to be hostile toward the other isn't a flaw, it's a feature that helped us survive. Sociologists add another layer. The image of the enemy unites the group. When there is a common threat, people forget about internal conflicts, unite, and submit to a leader. It's a classic, from the missile scare of the 1950s to any modern war. Political scientists continue. Those in power use the image of the enemy as a tool of control. Dissatisfied with the economy? Here are the migrants. Dissatisfied with corruption? Here is the West. Distraction through fear, a technique as old as the state itself. All of this is true. All of this works. And most people, when explaining the phenomenon of nationalism, war, and propaganda, will stop right there. It sounds reasonable, but something doesn't add up here. If the enemy is merely a tool of the government or an evolutionary reflex, then why does society continue to create enemies precisely when it is not in the government's interest to do so? And why can't liberal democracies, without an authoritarian center, do without images of the enemy? Here's the twist that changes everything. We don't need an enemy to fight. We need an enemy to answer the question, who are we? That sounds abstract, so let's get specific. Identity, whether national, political, religious, or cultural, does not exist on its own. It is always constructed through distinction from the other. I know who I am because I know who I am not. After the Cold War, Americans suddenly realized they didn't really understand what American identity consisted of without the Soviet threat. Not because the USSR defined them, but because the image of the enemy was the foundation from which they operated. The same goes for any nation, any movement, any community. Feminism defines itself in opposition to patriarchy. Conservatives define themselves in opposition to progressives. Believers define themselves in opposition to atheists. Take away the enemy, and you have to answer anew the question of why you even exist as a group. And that's when a truly uncomfortable question arises. What if the enemy isn't a consequence of identity? What if the enemy is a condition of its existence? In 1954, psychologist Muzafer Sharif conducted an experiment that is now prohibited from being replicated for ethical reasons. He took two groups of ordinary boys from well-to-do families, sent them to summer camp, and divided them into two groups. No special instructions, just two groups, eagles and rattlesnakes. After a few days, the groups learned of each other's existence, and without any adult intervention, it began. Insults, vandalism, and physical altercations. Ordinary children from good families. The sheriff observed the mechanism. As soon as them appears, us automatically emerges. Moreover, us immediately begins to reevaluate its own. Our boys turned out to be smarter, more honest, and braver in the eyes of their group, and their boys dumber, more cowardly, more dangerous. This isn't malice, it's a cognitive structure. The brain uses the image of the enemy as a reference point for its own self-esteem. Destructive, but functional. Okay, that's how the brain works, but this can be overcome, right? Let's see what history has to say.
Rome, late 2nd century BCE. Carthage has been destroyed. One of the Republic's chief enemies has been wiped off the face of the earth. Literally, Carthago delenda est. And they succeeded. What happens next? Historians note, it is precisely from this moment that the rapid decline of the Republic begins. Not because the enemy that kept them on their toes had disappeared, but because what defined who the Romans were had vanished. As long as Carthage existed, there was meaning in discipline, unity, and republican values. When Carthage fell, the elites immediately began settling scores among themselves. The next 100 years brought the Gracchi, Sulla, Marius, and civil wars, and ultimately the end of the Republic. Rome did not destroy itself out of weakness. Rome destroyed itself because it lost the enemy that had shaped its identity. This is not an exception, it is a rule that repeats itself over and over again. History confirms this, but you might be thinking, that's ancient Rome, what does that have to do with me? Here's what it has to do with you.
Look at what happened to Western liberal democracies after 1991. The Cold War ended. Communism was defeated. Fukuyama wrote about the end of history. Liberal democracy had triumphed. And what? 30 years later, these societies are in a state of acute internal discord. Polarization is at record levels. Trust in institutions is at an all-time low. The left and the right aren't just arguing, they see each other as existential enemies. This is no accident. After the disappearance of the external enemy, Western societies began to manufacture enemies within. Elites versus the people, progressives versus conservatives, the vaccinated versus anti-vaxxers. Each time, it's an image of the enemy that defines our camp. The external enemy has vanished. The internal one is being manufactured at double the speed because the need hasn't gone anywhere. There is one detail that is rarely discussed. Some researchers, particularly those working within the framework of the theory of death anxiety, argue that the image of the enemy serves another function that is difficult to acknowledge. When there is an enemy, there is meaning. Fighting the enemy gives a sense of significance, of being part of something bigger. The enemy literally makes your life important. You don't just exist, you stand against evil. That is precisely why talk shows built around the image of an enemy hold the audience's attention better than any other format. That is exactly why social media algorithms naturally amplify content based on fear and hatred. It creates engagement. Not because people are bad, but because the brain reads it as important, literally as a survival signal. The enemy is a drug with no legal substitutes. Now look a little higher. We've talked about psychology, about Rome, about modern polarization, but the mechanism we've examined isn't just about war and politics. It's about the architecture of any system designed to hold people together. Corporations. Apple has IBM, then Microsoft, then Samsung. Every startup has a bad old world that it has come to destroy. Every brand is the embodiment of what its customers are not. Religions. The devil is not just a figure in theology, he is a structural necessity. Without the forces of evil, good loses its form. Without sin, righteousness is meaningless. Without the lost, the saved lose their identity. Science and ideology. Scientific revolutions do not simply occur in favor of a new theory, they occur against the old one. Kuhn showed that a paradigm shift is always the victory of one camp over another, even in science. The enemy is not an anomaly of the system, the enemy is the system's supporting structure. Here is a metaphor that I think describes this most accurately. An arch without a keystone. The building materials are there, the structure stands, but remove the central element and everything crumbles, not because it has become weaker, but because that element was what held the structure in shape. The problem isn't that people are evil, the problem is that our methods for building collective identity are archaic. They were developed for tribes, for city-states, for imperial armies, and they still work today, because nothing better has been invented yet. Here's what I don't want to say. Now that you know this, you're free. That would be nice, but it wouldn't be true. Knowing how the mechanism works doesn't turn it off. You'll still feel irritation toward those who are different. Algorithms will still feed you enemies. Politicians will still manufacture them. But here's what changes when you understand this mechanism. You start to see the moment the enemy is manufactured. Not, here are the bad guys, but here's someone constructing an image of the enemy to gain something. These are different matters. The first closes off your thinking. The second opens it up. An enemy can be real. Threats can be real. That doesn't mean the image of the enemy they're selling you matches reality. It almost never does, because it's created not to describe reality, but to organize people. Distinguishing between a real threat and a fabricated enemy is perhaps the most important political literacy skill of our time. And no, they don't teach it in school. But there's YouTube. There's one question I'll leave for you to ponder. If an enemy is a way of knowing who you are, what does that say about you, about the enemies you're holding on to right now? It's not about whether they're right or wrong, it's about what exactly you gain by keeping them as enemies. It's an uncomfortable question. The most honest ones always are.